Hello, welcome to episode 128 of the CRICKETher Weekly. We are outside Lord's Cricket Ground in London. We have just watched the Invincibles defeat the Brave for the second year running in the Women's 100 final, but it was a bit closer than it maybe should have been, Sid.
Yeah, I think, last year we had that awesome performance from Kapp, which kind of, in a way, killed the game quite early on in the second innings because she just blew the Brave away. That wasn't quite what happened this time, was it? But at the end of the day, the Brave just didn't have enough guns on their decks. They went along at a run a ball. They posted 101, and it just wasn't enough runs. And the Invincibles were clearly quite quickly at a point, especially after Kapp's cameo, where all they needed to do was pootle along to win the game, and they were able to do that, weren't they?
Yeah, they just about were. It does feel very much like they kind of crawled across the line rather than leaping across it, which they did in last year's final, as you say. And you just kind of think like posting 101 in the first innings is not normally anything like enough in the women's 100. So actually it was quite a special performance with the ball in some ways by Brave to restrict Invincibles.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually I see it like that, to be honest. I think that it was more that Invincibles knew that they didn't have to go at a million miles an hour in order to get that win, and especially after Kapp Windsor came in, she was kind of, she was calm. She played some shots. She didn't totally restrict herself to just getting Kapp back on strike, which she could have done, and she hit a couple of boundaries, but basically she was just like, all I need to do is to stay here and we're going to win the game, and she did that, and I think that she was the really kind of crucial player in the end. Obviously Kapp got the player of the match performance again, second year running for the bat this time, and rightly so, but without Kapp Windsor having stayed with her, that performance doesn't happen because she was going to run out of partners. It quite quickly became apparent, didn't it, that the Brave were going to need to bowl them out in order to win the game, and they just couldn't quite take enough wickets. They didn't find Anya Shrubsole and Lauren Bell didn't quite find the swing they were looking for up top. There was a little bit of swing later with the ball, interestingly enough, but not quite enough that they could run through them in the way that they needed to by that point.
Okay, well, I thought that it was tighter than it perhaps should have been, and actually it was quite nervy towards the end, and Kapp Windsor did massively kind of take the pressure off by hitting that 4 down the ground, and I think it was what proved to be the penultimate set, but actually it was quite tight, and certainly one of those where you end up doing a little bit of a panicked rewrite. So Oval Invincibles champions for the second year running. Well deserved, Sid, because they came out top of both your batting and bowling rankings, didn't they?
Yeah, so last year it was actually really interesting last year looking at the sort of batting and bowling metrics, because Invincibles had by far the best bowling metrics but actually the worst batting metrics. But this year they've strengthened the team. They first of all strengthened by buying Lauren Winfield, and Lauren Winfield Hill, and that she was obviously has been a really important player for them, and I think she took the player of the tournament award, did she, or did Nat Siver get that?
I think it was Nat Siver actually.
Yeah, but she was obviously very close in that, and then of course Susie Bates coming in actually proved crucial. So Susie Bates wasn't originally going to play for them. She was picked up as their extra overseas, as we've discussed in our previous podcast done in pieces, but ended up being a really important part of that sum for them, not just because of the fact that she was able to step up to the captaincy, but because she was able to generally provide runs up top, although of course it wasn't her that did it today.
No, absolutely. I think it's an interesting dynamic that's been going on and kind of rumbling on in the background of Invincible's title defence this time around, with the switch up in the captaincy between Danae van Niekerk, who obviously expected in the pre-tournament press that she was doing, she expected to be playing and she expected to be captaining, and Susie Bates did not expect to be playing or captaining, and they've managed to kind of trade places and switch it up. And have still managed to be successful as a unit, which I think is testament to the players themselves, and probably to Susie Bates as a person as well, actually, in terms of being able to handle that situation in a sort of diplomatic way. And I do think that it wasn't a particularly great thing for the Invincibles management to put their players through, but the players have kind of come through it and ultimately been successful. And I was going to write in my Guardian piece, but I ran out of words. I was going to write that actually it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of, we've said that, well, I've certainly said that I think that the policy of having 4 overseas should be reviewed, because then you end up with, you're paying players a lot of money to come over to England for a few weeks and sit here and not do anything. And that money would be better spent on your lower tier domestic players, giving them a bit of a pay rise. So if they do review that, what are Invincibles going to do? Who are they going to get rid of? Which of their 4 players? So that's going to be a tricky one. But anyway, that is a question for next season. For now, Invincibles will be celebrating, and rightly so. So in terms of the 100 overall this year, Sid, there are probably a couple of questions, big questions about the future of the tournament and what it might look like next year that we might want to talk about. The first is, and this is something that Beth Barrett-Wild, as the ECB head of the Women's 100, has been asked about a couple of times, relating to, should there be a draft for the Women's 100? Because at the moment there isn't a draft. It's actually done on a kind of case-by-case basis. I believe that the teams have individual negotiations with the players and trying to get them in and entice them in and say, oh, we think that we might offer you this much money. Should there be a draft as there is in the Men's 100?
Well, I mean, I think that what we're trying to do here is address a particular problem, right? The particular problem is that we're already in a situation after just 2 years of this tournament where it's clear who the top sides are. It's pretty clear who the bottom sides are either. Welsh Fire, I'm afraid. And people are going, well, how can we address this? And a draft feels like a panacea, but I'm not convinced that it actually. You have to understand what the purpose of a draft is and what problems it actually solves. A draft works. The classic example of the draft is the way that it works in American football. But the American football is a very, very different setup, and you've got a sort of trickle draft where they draft new players in every year from the college system, and it's very clear that there's a very clear pathway through that draft, and that draft really is the only serious way into the professional American football system, and that's not something that exists here. You'd have to have different drafts for overseas players, different drafts for domestic players, and I'm not even sure quite how you get there from here. I mean, do you redraft everybody? That's obviously something that people have asked about, and what Beth Barrett-Wild is saying is that doesn't feel realistic at this stage. You don't want to redraft everybody, but on the other hand, if you don't redraft everybody, you're not actually starting really to solve the problem of the fact that we've got this big gap starting to emerge already between the best and the worst.
Yeah, I think that one of the issues that you've got is this: if you take all of the marquee, so the England and the international overseas players out of it, and you look at the quality of the teams, then clearly Southern Brave have got the best domestic players, and it's because that reflects what Charlotte Edwards has done with that regional side and that regional setup. It's basically Vipers, but better. And then you've also got, in terms of the Welsh Fire, if you look at their domestic players, that's something that we've talked about as being a little bit of an issue, in the sense of Wales having a slightly weaker structure. They don't have a region, they don't have a regional women's team in Wales, so you've not got that same basis. So even if you kind of say, oh, we'll just do it for the marquee players, you aren't solving that big problem, are you? So I think that it is a tricky one, and of course the big thing that we don't want to end up with is a situation where you go, oh, we'll just bin it all off and start again from scratch, and so any of those attachments to players that fans have formed, no, we'll just get rid of those. That doesn't seem like a great idea either.
Absolutely.
Okay, the other question, and I believe, because I was talking to Dan Norcross about this the other day, who obviously is an important commentator on BBC Test Match Special, was saying that they might be going to talk about this on the radio. I don't know if they have or not, because we were obviously at the ground, but should the Women's 100 be standalone? So we're obviously now in a situation where we've had 2 years of double headers. The double header model seems to be working successfully in the sense of we're getting bigger crowds this year. To the crowds that we had.
20,000 people in here for the women's match, ahead of the men's match.
Yeah, which is obviously a record. Last year for the women's final we had 17,000. So, and Beth Barrett-Wild also tweeted saying that the overall audience numbers at the ground this year is up, despite the fact that they had 8 fewer matches this year. So the metrics in terms of the double headers seem to be working well for the women, but for some reason there's kind of this question about should we be moving to a standalone model. I suppose partly because that's something that Australia have done with the WBBL, and have done quite successfully, and maybe that's something that's being talked about because of that.
Yeah, it's a question. If you'd asked me 2 years ago whether I supported the double headers model, I'd have said absolutely no. But it does seem to have been successful, and I sort of feel that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That where we are at the moment, it really seems to be working very nicely. I don't think that there are any particular issues with it. So do we actually need to fix it? What's your perspective, Raf?
Yeah, well, I was actually thinking about this, and often, and we do this as well. We think of double headers as being something that benefits the women, because we are getting bigger crowd figures as a result. And actually, potentially, I think that we need to look at it from a different perspective, because I think that potentially we're at a moment with the 100 now whereby the men need us just as much, if not more, than we need them. And there are a couple of reasons for me saying that. And the first is that clearly the women's 100, relatively speaking, is a much stronger competition than the men's competition, because we are actually getting the best players from all over the world to play in the women's 100. The men are not getting that. And the men are often getting people like pulling out or ducking out or going, oh, I'm busy. They obviously had the men's Lord's Test right in the middle of the 100, so the England men's players weren't going to play in it. So clearly our competition is better than their competition in the sense of actually getting the stronger players in. Now, if you think about that from a kind of fan perspective, that does actually reflect, I think, in the crowds, because yes, the men do get bigger crowds than we do for the 100. That's undoubtedly true. So we've got 20,000 for the women's final. More people will be coming in for the men's final, but we started from a much lower base than the men did. So we started from a point where you're getting 200 people coming to a Rachel Hayhoe Flint Trophy match or a Charlotte Edwards Cup match. Okay, the men started from a basis where the Oval is regularly selling out for men's T20 Blast matches, so they've already got that. Then it's not adding anything in that sense. So actually, the women's 100 is arguably much more successful than the men's 100. So if they want the men's 100 to keep being a success, they need to keep the double headers, I think. Otherwise, what's going to happen is, this is my second point, is that the men's 100 will uncouple from the women's 100, and all the people who have been enjoying the women's 100 because it's great cricket, it's all of the most exciting players in the world, and also, crucially, much more family friendly in terms of the fan experience, bringing people along. Bringing your kids along to the women's 100 is a nice experience. Bringing your kids along to the men's 100, there are quite a lot of people having a boozy time, let's say, and it's much more like a Friday night T20 Blast crowd at the Oval. So those people are going to want to come to the women's 100. So they're going to maybe potentially have issues with the men's 100 if they try and decouple it. So I think the men need us as much, if not more, than we need them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I think that over and above that, if you're the ECB, your perspective is likely to be that you need the women's 100 in order to create a sort of holistic experience across both tournaments, because the fact is that the men's 100 is not the best against the best, and if the men's and women's 100s were separate tournaments, in fact I think the ECB would be under huge pressure at the moment to abolish the men's tournament, because it just hasn't been quite as relatively successful, as you say, as the women's. So I think that sticking them together and keeping them together is probably what makes sense in the medium term, but we'll see what they do.
We will, absolutely. Now, on a related point, cricket swiftly moves on as the season happens. We know that we're getting an England squad announced in 2 days' time, or in 1 day's time by the time that we release this. It's happening on the Monday. We're going to get a squad announcement for the matches, the internationals, England against India. And now we did have a couple of questions come in from Margaret Glossop on Twitter. And she was basically saying, so this relates to the England squad. On the basis of the stats in the 100, are you expecting any surprise additions or omissions for the upcoming series for India? She also kind of adds, does some players need a rest? Does Lauren Winfield-Hill deserve a place? She thinks that she does. So you have been crunching the numbers a bit this week, haven't you, Sid, with your batting and your bowling stats. So on that basis, is there anyone who you're expecting to see in the England squad? Let's focus on the positives. Let's not focus on the omissions. Are there any additions that you're expecting to see?
Honestly, I don't really think so. I think that in terms of batting, we've very much seen that the usual suspects perform well, and nobody's really that's not already kind of part of the squad has stood up particularly and gone, I deserve that spot. Obviously, Lauren Winfield-Hill has performed well, and there's definitely, she's been keeping wicket, and we've been speculating perhaps that she might see that as a route back into the England team. But obviously she remains part of the England squad. She's a centrally contracted player, so it wouldn't be that huge a surprise if she did come back. But I think she probably won't, honestly. The bowling thing's perhaps a little bit more interesting. We've seen a couple of outstanding performances over the course of the 100 from non-England bowlers. Em Arlott has ranked really highly. She's been bowling well, she's been taking wickets, she's been going at a really good economy rate. Of course, someone that was very unlucky to miss out on she was been part of a couple of England squads and has missed out on selection, wasn't selected last year, then had long after effects of COVID this year and missed out. So she's someone that definitely could be included. Who else have we got? Sophia Smale. She's come through and she's taken the 100 by storm. Really, she's been almost this year's capsy.
I just wrote that.
I think that obviously her issue is that she's a left arm spinner, and Sophie Eccleston's got that gig sewn up. So at the moment, unless there's an injury to Sophie Eccleston, then I can't see her getting in the squad at this stage. Although they're definitely, I think that she's almost certainly going to go to the T20 Under-19 World Cup. So that'll be a positive for her that she's achieved. I'm not sure she'd have necessarily been expecting to go to that 4 or 5 months ago, but now she'll be one of the first names on that list. So that's definitely someone I think we'll be seeing more of in future.
Great. I think you might be right about Smale, although there's nothing to say that you can't play two left-arm spinners in the same team.
And I think that's in the laws. That's law 27X, Raf.
And on form, you'd have to say Emily Arler will probably displace somebody else in that team. It depends how much attention they actually pay to the 100 as a competition, which in itself is a question that we unfortunately are not qualified to answer. You'd have to have a chat to Heather Knight and Lisa Kitely about that one. I think the Winfield-Hill thing is interesting because England's strategy for a long time now has been to persist with Amy Jones because she's the best keeper, like by miles the best keeper, but even though her batting's been very inconsistent, actually what Lauren Winfield-Hill has shown this tournament is, hello, I'm going to put my hand up as the very consistent batter, and my keeping might not be as good, but maybe you should change your tactics, England, and think about picking somebody who's less of a good keeper but a better batter. Don't know. That would obviously be a big about turn for England if they were going to do that, but I think, as you say, that might be Lauren Winfield-Hill's aim ultimately, her way to crack back into the England team. Now, what's going to be one of the really interesting things about this upcoming series against India is actually going to be that it's going to be Lisa Kitely's last series as coach, and there has been continued chat around that, partly on the basis that we've been playing in the 100 and the players and the coaches have been in the 100, and Charlotte Edwards is obviously one of the coaches who's reached the finals today, and she's been asked at least 3 or 4 times is she going to apply.
Once by Raf last night as she was trying to get on the bus.
The verdict appears to be, both what she said to me and what she said to everyone else, the verdict appears to be she hasn't decided yet. She needs to sit down and have a think about it, and that's absolutely fair enough because she's been chock-a-block with cricket since Lisa Kitely announced her decision, so fine. On the other hand, there has been some interesting stuff because Heather Knight has been doing commentary for the 100 and has been asked a few times, and there was one interview as well with CRICKETher this week where they asked her, who do you think, or do you think that Charlotte Edwards should be the next England coach? And Heather Knight's kind of got this line that she's been trotting out, which is I've actually got the extract from the CRICKETher piece. I'm not sure she'll go for it, to be honest. She's done brilliant things down at Vipers, but I guess the thing for her to decide is whether it's too soon to coach some of the senior players in the side that she played with. I'm pretty confident she'll coach England at some point, but whether now's the right time is up to her. And she said something very similar to that actually on the BBC during the Eliminator. So that's obviously, as I say, that's her kind of standard line. that she's trotting out a bit, and I think that's really interesting because she's trying to be diplomatic, but it seems fairly obvious that it just feels like she's trying to say, actually, I think it's a bit too soon, and I'm not sure that we'd work very well together potentially, because we played together, and therefore it's a bit too soon. You need to wait a couple more years, and then I won't be captain anymore. I'll maybe even be retired, and then that's fine. You can fill your boots, Lottie. So that's actually kind of interesting that Heather Knight's come out and said that. So on that, I don't know whether that will have an effect on Charlotte Edwards' decision about whether or not she runs. You would hope that she's going to kind of talk to a variety of people and make a decision, on the basis of lots of different people's opinion. But it's been interesting to hear Heather Knight say that. I think maybe we'll wrap up there, Sid. We've really enjoyed the 100, haven't we? I feel like it's been pretty successful, certainly from a crowd perspective, as we've been saying. And we've enjoyed it, but it's back into the England stuff this time next week, and also the Rachel Hayhoe Flint Trophy resuming back to your beloved Vipers on Friday and Sunday. We're excited about that. I know you're excited about that. You can put your orange shirt back on, ditch the green, and get back to what you really love, Sid. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. See you next week.
Bye.